Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. How's that volume? Is that okay? Good, good. My name is Dan Barlow. I'll be your moderator for this session. This is Comics That Change the Conversation. We're going to be talking with some cartoonists who create comics to educate, to create social change, and to leave the world a better place. As I said, my name is Dan Barlow. My background is I'm the co-founder of the now defunct Trees and Hills Comics Collective. We published about a dozen comic anthologies between 2006 and 2012 about water quality, the benefits of playtime, and many other issues. I'm also a former journalist, former socially responsible business lobbyist, and I currently run a free healthcare clinic in my town of Barry City, about an hour south of here. So proud to introduce our panel here, and I will say I think we want to keep this conversation very kind of natural and flowing, so if you have questions or comments from the crowd, just raise your hand and we'll call it to you, and to the panelists as well. Feel free to respond to each other and go back and forth. I think the best would be to have a fluid conversation among all of us. So first, I'm proud to introduce Brian Box Brown. Is an Ignatz Award-winning cartoonist, illustrator, and comic publisher from Philadelphia. His book, Andre the Giant, Life and Legend, released in 2014, spent 3 weeks on the New York Times graphic novel bestsellers list. He launched the comics publishing house Retrofit Comics in 2011. In 2019, his book, Is This Guy for Real? The Unbelievable Andy Kaufman, won the Eisner Award for Best Reality-Based Work. He has a syndicated nonfiction comic strip, Legalization Nation. So, welcome, Brian. Up next is Michelle Sayles. Michelle is a cartoonist, illustrator, and comic artist currently based in Worcester, Mass. She was a participating artist in the comic anthology, The Most Costly Journey, which you can buy here today, and lead author of an accessibility webcomic for McMaster University's Office of Equity and Inclusion. She has a master's in globalization studies from McMaster University, where her graduate research explored the relationship between mental health, trauma studies, and climate change. She has created works of graphic journalism, large-scale street comic installations, political cartoons, and posters to inspire critical awareness of the world we live in. She currently works for the American Association on Health and Disability. Thank you for being here, Michelle. And finally, Isabella Rotman is a cartoonist and illustrator from Maine. Her art is usually about the ocean, mermaids, crushing loneliness, people in the woods, or sex. She is the author of A Quick and Easy Guide to Consent, illustrator and co-author of Wait, What? A Comic Book Guide to Relationships, Bodies, and Growing Up, and artist in residence at scarletteen.com. Isabella was nominated for the Promising New Talent Ignatz Award in 2017, and her comic Like the Tide was nominated for Outstanding Online Comic in 2020. Isabella is the creator of This Might Hurt Tarot, a modern and queer 78-card tarot deck based on the historic Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which I bought a copy of today and looking forward to reading that later. So welcome to the panelists, and we'll start just if each of you can talk a little bit about what you're currently working on, what your current passion is, and how that relates to the issues of social justice and education and awareness. And Brian, we'll start with you if you don't mind.
Hi. So my current work that I've been doing is, for the last year or two, is a comic strip called Legalization Nation, which takes a look at cannabis legalization and how it's kind of rolling out throughout the country. I started doing it because I was I've been a lifelong cannabis user since birth, but since young adulthood, and I had never really considered myself like an activist. But when I became a medical patient in Pennsylvania and saw like how the legal system was like working there, it drove me to activism because there were so many patients being like underserved, and I just was watching all this stuff happen and just being like, there's so many mistakes being made over and over again, and I wanted to cover it in book form, but cannabis legalization is happening so rapidly that by the time I had written a book went through the whole publishing process, it would have been at least like 3 years out of date, which is, a lifetime in this sector. So I started doing a weekly comic strip, which is like the last thing you might want to do in 2022. But I actually did. It is syndicated now and is now in print in an alt weekly, which was kind of like my dream when I got into comics in the early 2000s, was to be in an alt weekly, and this strip now is in the Tucson Weekly and a couple other online outlets. So I've been working on that and doing activism as well. It's interesting making friends and also making enemies doing this, because there are so many people in legalization who are they're just like bloodthirsty capitalists, really, and not looking out for the best interests of patients or consumers, even, or anybody. I just thought that like cannabis is a situation where we're writing legislation starting from zero, and we don't have to start with the most corrupt possible situation. Like, it might get corrupted, almost certainly will be, but like we don't have to start by giving corporations the biggest possible advantage and making it the worst possible situation for users and patients. So that's what I'm working on now.
Michelle?
Sure. So I'm currently based down in Worcester, Massachusetts, and most of my work has been in relationship with different grassroots campaigns, and more recently some environmental campaigns. I'm involved with the No Coal, No Gas campaign, which is an effort to shut down the Merrimack Generating Station in Bow, New Hampshire. It's the last coal plant in New England. So I've been kind of involved with that movement since college. Started out doing anti-fracking comics down in Pennsylvania when the fracking boom took off there in 2008. And so I'm kind of circling back around thematically to wanting to tackle climate issues and thinking through like, what does that mean for how we are living and how that affects every facet of our lives? So I am doing some of that work in relationship with the campaign and thinking up collaborations on my own. But also have done some work in the realm of kind of equitable community development. So earlier this summer, I collaborated with Partners for Dignity and Rights it was a 40-page report that they pulled together on equitable strategies for community-centered development. And so talking about the issue of gentrification, how do we tackle this? How do we deal with racialized lending practices? How do we implement solutions like community land trusts to create cities that we can live in, communities we can live in equitably? And so I helped pull together illustrations for that to bring kind of the comics method of visual metaphor into this report to make this information accessible. So it was a way to look at like, okay, what is creating the issue in the housing market right now? So much of it is massive investment from people who've got their money in set away in savings, and that's become an investment opportunity. And so I tried to capture that as like this nesting egg as a wrecking ball, like coming into the cities and just knocking down buildings. And so
it's almost like editorial illustration.
Definitely, yep.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Cool.
So that was a kind of by way of political cartooning and editorial cartooning landed at comics, and still doing that now.
Awesome, thank you. Isabella?
Yeah, I don't know if I should even talk about what I'm going to be working on next because it's not announced or I haven't even really started, but I think I'm going to do it anyway. So, I mean, my sex ed stuff has most often come from like where I'm seeing like a hole that I think comics could fill well. So my first sex ed book was like, oh, all the sex ed comics I'm seeing are like for straight people, and if they talk about anything queer, it's like HIV, AIDS, be scared, gay men, and then that's like it, and queer women were like really left out of it, and non-binary people weren't even like recognized. This was like 2013 when I did that, and there's so many more comics that are doing that now, and that space is so much more occupied, which is great. And yeah, it's just been like, oh, I don't see this being done. I think it should be done. I think comics could could do this. So the thing I would really like to do next, which I haven't even really started, is after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, I would like to make a zine about medical abortion, which is the pills, because I do think like this is the way a lot of people are going to be able to access abortion. And something I don't see talked about a lot is that when you take medical abortion pills, it's 2 different pills, but you actually can do it. It's less effective, but you can do it just with one of those pills. And that pill is also used to treat ulcers, so you could kind of sneaky get it. So basically, I would like to make a zine about how to have an illegal abortion and get away with it, and collaborate with some people I won't mention because I haven't told them I'm talking about it publicly. Hopefully collaborate with some of my cartoonist friends, and that is the next thing that I'd like to do in the nonfiction sector, because I think that I was talking about this with my host, Kristen Schell, who I'm staying with last night, but she was talking about like, oh, if you have like a skill, are you obligated to use it to make the world better? And I don't think so. I think we get to make art for any reason we want, even if that reason is just that we're fun. But I do think if you want to make the world better and you have a skill, you should use that skill instead of, going about it in a way that might be more traditional. Or do both. I just think like if you have a way to approach a problem, it's probably that, and a special skill that you have is probably more effective for you to use your skills than to go to a protest and be one more body at a protest.
I would like to add to that because like I kind of got into this doing this strip for that reason as well.
Yeah.
Like, where it was like I was already involved in this activism thing and like making a comic about Vladimir Putin or whatever. What I'm saying? But like, and I'd just be like on like Twitter or something and be like, this shouldn't be this way, this should be that way. And like, too few people would read it and be like, yeah. And I was like, I know how to make comics like this. I feel like this could break through and like get heard, like, and like, it does. Like that's I think the thing is like the comics are like powerful in the way that they can like break down something super complicated into like an understandable thing.
Yeah.
Right? And like in these spaces, like cannabis legalization space, or in the space sex ed space, like they're not used to that. Like they are like, what the fuck? Like they, like the cannabis people are like, what the fuck is this? Like they have no idea. They're like, but they love it though. Like this is like, this is the voice. It's become like a voice for people that hadn't had one, like hadn't been able to voice these gripes or concerns with the situation. And like, it's just like the power of comics. Like I forget, like I sit there making comics all day long. Like it's like rote to me sometimes, but like when it gets out into the world, you can like literally see that there's like a power to what comics can do.
I have my own theories, but I would love to hear what you think makes comics such a powerful.
It's so like I think about this old when comics were like first in newspapers, like in like the turn of the century and stuff, and up until not that long ago, it continues today, but they were really like a big thing that sold the newspapers was the comics, and people would say like comics get read, like people will write in the newspaper, people just like flip through it, but like everybody reads the comics. You know what I mean? It's like people are drawn to it like naturally, and I don't know, break stuff down for people. It's easy to understand and like makes people that see comics and are drawn to it are like, it's like a thing. It's like a tractor beam for certain.
Yeah, I mean, just pictures. People want to look at pictures, right? And comics are kind of innately non-pretentious. It's like a lot of people make pretentious comics, but I think you have to like try. And I always think like sometimes about like drawing certain ways is like you use beauty to like seduce people into listening to you.
Yeah.
A lot of times I'm like choosing my drawing style.
Yeah,
based
it is
off
like
of
that. It's like no, you have to sit here and read this whole thing. I'm not even gonna be there. Just like it's a time bomb.
I'm not even gonna be there.
I gotta say, this is a great panel because they already jumped into my next question, which was like, why comics as a medium to do this? So Brian, you talked about how you can use comics to break down complex situations and make it easy to understand for your readers. Michelle, do you want to talk a little bit about why comics is the medium you use to tackle these big issues?
Sure. And to answer that, I'm going to start off with a story of somebody else's comic that I wanted to highlight.
Yeah.
So part of the reason I think comics are so powerful is because you can use, allegory. You can use a lie to tell the truth. You can. There's a book that just came out called A Radical Shift in Gravity, and it's a story about what would happen, told all visually. What would happen if the gravitational pull on human beings started to be less and less, and people are floating up into the air? It's like a moonscape, and it's this allegory for climate change. And so it tackles this issue, and you get this feeling of like everything is shifting in this world that has been created, and you're seeing the people who are in denial about it, who are adapting to it in their own ways, and I think it was just such a powerful way to feel something that like we're living in every day, we're hearing on the news every day, and you just numb over at a certain point. And I think comics can play a role in like getting at the emotional story that makes you remember, oh yeah, this is why I care about this. This is what it means at a real level.
Yeah.
So,
Isabella, anything to add to that?
I think I said my.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
you
I
did.
said my thing.
There was a question over there. Yes.
Yeah, I can't remember which comment sparked this question for me, but I was hoping that all three of you could speak to how you go about defining or targeting a particular audience. Since you're all sort of like working on a specific issue, where in your creative process does thinking about the audience you want to speak to come into that? How specific do you get? How much is it just sort of like projection of your own ideas?
So I like think about this a lot because my strip is like, I'm like so involved in this situation that the strip sometimes is like inside baseball. Like I want to like not make it like jargony and stuff, but I do want to explain some sort of sometimes like inside baseball, like in the weeds stuff, because it's like important to know it. But then sometimes I'm like, well, who is this for? Is this for people that are already are aware of all this stuff and like they're ready for like this like stuff that's a little more in depth? Or is it for someone who knows nothing at all and they need like so like I go back and forth all the time. So I'm like I constantly feel like I have to define basic terms a lot. Like I really like almost made like a visual glossary, but I just never got down to it because like there's so many things like that. Like there's this one term that gets used all the time. It's called multi-state operator, and it's a corporate cannabis company that operates in multiple states. And it's like, and we just say like MSO, and it's like that term I have to redefine and define all the time. So I just call it like corporate cannabis because it's like a shorthand. But
It'd be easier if you were doing like a whole book, because then you could just define your terms.
all
and
the
move on.
terms. I know it's difficult to do the contemporaneous. It's different. Like 'cause I've done a bunch of graphic novel biographies and nonfiction stuff, and it's a lot different doing it contemporaneously. It's a lot funnier looking. You do like contemporaneous work sometimes, right? Like, and you look back on it when you're doing a strip, and you're like, what was I even talking about? It's like because it's so like focused on like the news that week.
right.
Yeah.
You know, things change so rapidly.
Michelle, anything to add?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking like, oh, I've kind of taken for granted that so much of the work that I've done has been for the community that, the campaign, for the people in that movement, kind of speaking back to that community and kind of documenting some of it, kind of capturing the spirit of what's happening in a campaign at a certain time, and just being a way to kind of be in conversation with like, this is what we're doing and this is what's working and this is the energy that we're trying to communicate to other people, kind of as a secondary, but also let's keep our spirits high, I think has been the main piece of a lot of what I've done. But there have been other more public-facing comics that I've done as well. There was a piece I did with the group Vermonters for Justice in Palestine a couple years ago, and the idea was, let's make something that is going to be hung on the side of a building as a guerrilla installation during Art Hop, and it is going to be an exposure to the story of a Palestinian woman born 1948 to kind of map the political situation to her life in decade snapshots. So just saying, like, you don't have to come to this with any knowledge of what's going on, and also this isn't going to answer every question politically, but this is an introduction to say, this is what it's like from the experience of someone who is maybe not represented in a lot of stories, and so it was based on documentary and a lot of research to pull that together. So that was very much aimed at, like, let's make this digestible and accessible and not pull in the political situation as much, even though it is a heated political discussion.
In sex ed, the biggest limiting demographic you have to decide on is age. So, like, what age group am I writing this for? And then it is really hard to be like, okay, what information are they ready for? And then how do I phrase it in a way that makes sense to this age group? So, I mean, I was really lucky with Wait What that my co-author had a lot more experience working with the age group than I did. But the best thing that we did for Wait What was just show it to a bunch of 6th graders and be like, hey guys, what do you think? And they gave really great feedback, and we made changes based off of it, and it was super helpful. So yeah, other than age, I try to make my books for everybody, because I think everybody needs sex ed. Even if you don't want to have sex and don't think you're going to, I think you still need sex ed. So, yeah.
Great, and great question. Thank you. Comics are a visual medium, and all three of you are often trying to deliver extensive information via this medium. How do you find that balance between delivering that information and then actually having artwork that's engaging to the reader? How do you avoid just having a bunch of talking heads essentially on the page? And Isabella, why don't we start with you?
I sometimes worry I have too many talking heads. I usually rely on, like, having fun characters that, like, do kooky stuff and, like, funny body language and, like, educate each other more than, like, me talking. I've found that, like, I don't want to really make any comics anymore that are like me being like, I'm Isabella and this is what I think. Because if I have a character instead, then that character has a lot more freedom to make mistakes and be wrong than I give myself. And then other characters can disagree and they have a conversation, which is, like, way better than a talking head. But also, like, visual metaphor, you can really, like, people's ability to, like, stretch their mind is so great, and they don't even realize they're doing it when they're reading. And I think just kind of go far with it. Yeah.
It's funny. You're saying when you were debating, you make a character instead of putting yourself in there.
Yeah.
I did my book downstairs called Are You Too High? It's about like when people take too much edibles or something like that, like, what do you do? Anyway, but so I was like, we're making it, and I was like, all right, there's gonna have to be a narrator. I'm like, should I make it myself or should I make it like a cartoon bunny? And I, like, asked Twitter, and I was like, who would you trust more, a cartoonist or a cartoon bunny? And it was like 99% cartoon bunny.
Yeah.
So cartoon bunny is the character. And
That's great.
Not me. Yeah, that's funny. It's funny because it's like, I put myself in my strip a lot because it's like when I'm doing interviews or something, it'll be like me asking the question or whatever, and sometimes it's like me literally having some experience with cannabis, like reporting on a thing that happened. But, like, I've done it with me in it and without me in it, and I think that, like, having the character in there, like, even if it's just like this tangential little thing, like, helps people relate to the topic more than just like being like, this is here's like a report on this. There's like a narrator kind of, it like draws people in sometimes.
The Joe Sacco approach.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever used myself as a character in a comic strip, but Cartoon Bunny sounds like a good way to get around that.
Yeah.
I've used myself to introduce a comic where during grad school I did a kind of research-based comic where I was interviewing folks who had done disability advocacy on campus, but then most of the story itself was sharing like the timeline of what accessibility changes had looked like since the 70s and 80s, and then ending with kind of anonymized just anonymous cartoons representing some of the students and alumni and faculty that we had interviewed for this story. So I think I used myself at the beginning just to say, like, I did these interviews, this was the process, and then just dropped out and turned it more toward sharing kind of the tone of each of these periods of time and what those changes had looked like, and really focusing more on, like, I want to create a single panel that is capturing the essence of that moment and what that was about, and then ending on a note of the talking heads.
Yeah.
Jumping more to the verbal, but
I've been doing more. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say every subject matter has like so many visual things that you can like pull out and use and just like, you know, build bar graphs out of like accessibility devices, and like you could do all this fun stuff, and it's better than talking heads.
I've been using talking hand, like not talking hands, but like instead of using a talking head, I often have just the hands representing something that they're talking about. It's always like a guy giving another person money, or like something like in that way, or like I'm holding this out for a bunch of people to try to get. Like, it's almost like using heads, but it's hands.
We are about at the halfway point for this panel, so I want to turn to the audience and see if any folks have any other questions or comments before we return to some more questions. Okay. While I was planning for this panel, I was thinking about how all three of you do work that really challenges sometimes powerful corporate interests, sometimes dominant paradigms, and how that is actually kind of dangerous now in the world of social media, where you can suddenly have a target on your back because of what you're working on. I was thinking of Genderqueer, the memoir about being non-binary and asexual, is the most banned book this year. And I'm kind of curious if any of you have confronted or encountered some real opposition, either from powerful interest or from like slimy internet trolls, and how you respond to that as a creator and as a human being.
So I get this stuff all the time, like all of the above. Like regularly, I'll have like PR people from cannabis companies like following me and being like, "Hey, like this is like not blah blah blah." And if it's somebody that's like, I do PR for Curaleaf, like in their bio, I just block them immediately because all they're gonna do is like those people are there to like change the conversation and distract people from it. So I like get that. I don't even care. I'm like, you're saying that you are working for this company, so you're out. And they get pissed. They get really mad. And so I've gotten into little scuffs with people like that. This happened to me like literally last week. I was interviewed for High Times magazine, like the print edition, and then they said it was like an hour-long interview. Like they went through this whole process with this writer, and then they pulled it suddenly, and I was like, and with no explanation at all, and I was like, I wonder why. Like I wonder what's going on here, and I was like, I wonder if I ever said anything about High Times on my Twitter. And I went and looked, and I was like, yeah, the first thing that comes up is like, I remember this too, because I was like, yeah, the High Times 100 influential cannabis people is like 95 CEOs and like one activist and 2 celebrities, which is absolutely true. And so if that was the reason that they pulled the interview, it speaks to the the comment itself, because they pulled the interview
Yeah.
with the activist journalist instead of, and then they're going to highlight some other CEO. But, it's annoying at first because you're like, what the fuck? But then I'm like, good. This is the whole point of the strip, really, is to piss these people off. And so if they're pissed off, I'm doing it correctly. And no, fuck High Times.
There's been a pretty large movement in the last few years to remove books with sexual or LGBTQ content from libraries, or to remove them from children's or YA sections of libraries and put them in the adult sections. And these two have been the target of some of those movements. And then there's been some posts on Facebook I've seen where people will take pictures of the pages and call my co-author and I perverts. So for the most part, no one messages me directly. It's very interesting. It's like they think that I'm not a real person. And librarians go to bat for the books, and that's where it plays out. It's very strange. You just put something out in the world and then other people defend it. But it's interesting because before I had published books, I expected very conservative kickback to them, and that's not what happened. What happened was actually the people who I was making the books for would come to me with criticisms like, oh, I don't think it's trans inclusive enough, or blah blah blah, and those were criticisms that I was like, oh, my feelings. And then I was like, okay, let's take this seriously. Let's become better. Let's do this better. Sometimes they were legitimate criticisms, and sometimes they were like, I don't think you read the book. But it really was not until the last 2 years that the actual people who are not, part of the people I consider myself writing for were coming for my work. And yeah, it's all so strange. And all I can really say is thank goodness for librarians.
It is really. I mean, at some point you're like, who cares? These people obviously don't understand the point of this messaging, but it still feels bad, right? When you first see it, you're like, what the?
There was one comment where they posted my co-author and I's bio pictures, these two, and the comment was like, here's the authors, of course, and then eye rolling, and I was like, what is? I don't even, what?
Yeah.
I don't know what they were talking about. My hair's blue? I don't know.
Of course they look cool, right?
Right. Oh, and someone else called us childless, blue-haired they-thems, which is really funny because my co-author uses they-them and I have blue hair and neither of us are both. Anyway, childless they-thems.
There's a lot of stuff like that. I mean, it's just so dumb. Some of them it's so dumb. You're just like, great, whatever. You make I've had a post go viral before, and then they're like, of course the stoner says. It's okay, great. Yeah.
Michelle?
I think my laziness around social media has played to my advantage in this realm. I'm only recently jumping back into Twitter and I'm on Instagram, but for the most part, it's at my table. But I feel like for the most part, it's been when we did the comic at Art Hop, I was thinking oh my gosh, are we going to be trolled in real time? But mostly it was just people looking really relaxed and chill. Yeah. And we had a notebook when it hung at the Fletcher Free Library later, and just lots of positive feedback, not much trolling. I'm like, oh well, I feel untested.
See, this is the thing. I don't think the trolls are numerous. I think they're just loud. Yeah. And in the real world, you're hardly ever going to see one.
Yeah.
Totally.
Most people are okay.
I like that optimism, honey. Any questions or comments from the crowd? I'm also yes.
I was curious if any of you have done any work where your opinion about the issue has changed, or if you have learned something in the process and diverged from the person that you were collaborating with.
That's a good question.
I've like updated my work to keep up with the times. Like I've gone back into work I did in 2013 and removed gendered pronouns. But I don't feel like that was me changing. I feel like that was society changing and me being like, oh yeah, cool.
Yeah, I mean, I get stuff. My stuff gets challenged all the time by people because it's like always controversial. Like, for instance, like there's a protest coming up, cannabis protest coming up on October 24th in DC, and the organizers like want me to promote it, and I have to look at who's running this protest. You know, what is the point of this? You know, you look in it, and it's run by this group called Last Prisoner Project, which is like the biggest cannabis nonprofit. And you look at that, and what are they doing? Who's funding Last Prisoner Project? So activists look at this large, enormous nonprofit that's like the biggest cannabis nonprofit. Activists look at it and are like, it's a sham because they have like $2 million in funding, and they're using it to focus on issues that don't harm corporations because the corporations are funding this. And so it's really like laundering the corporate reputation and making sure that the loudest nonprofit group in the room is not focused on any antitrust, anti-monopolization stuff. And it's like, how do you criticize what they're actually doing though? Because they're trying to get prisoners released from prison, which we agree on. But like, also, they aren't really trying to do that. They're not really trying to do anything except for promote themselves by way of promoting these other companies. So, you know, I've had stuff out there where I would say, point stuff like this out, and then it's like a laundry list of people being like, no, they're great. What are you talking about? Tommy Chong is with them. And so it's very argumentative. All of the activists fight with each other constantly. I mean, it's like all infighting constantly, all the time. So you have to be like ready to defend your positions, really. And sometimes people do say stuff like, "Well, what if we did it this way? Like, isn't that really helping out these corporations at the same time?" And you have to think about it like, yeah, you're right. Like that is actually this like more complex issue than I had previously thought about. And sometimes it's a lot less complex because part of the smoke screen is to make things complex. Like legalization is like ridiculously overly complex to the point where you can't even understand it. And so like a lot of times it's like they're purposely making it a complex issue when really it's black and white. So yeah, there's always constant fighting all the time. Joe?
I love this question. I think with some of the projects that I've done, I've looked back and wondered about the method of was this the right approach to take in trying to cover this story? Particularly thinking about the Palestine comic, which was one of the earliest things that I had done. And I don't know that I would have changed some of the story per se, but I feel like there's something to be said for being super intentional about like being in conversation with folks in that community, with making, and I was in conversation with VTJP, and a number of those folks are from Palestine. So that was at play. But I have gone back and looked at that and thought, man, I wish I had done that a little bit differently and had more time to make that as collaborative as it maybe could or should have been.
Yeah, I was just thinking of another thing, like in my cannabis book, like there was prevailing studies that showed like when cannabis came over to the New World. And so I based it on a couple different sources, all have the same thing. And after I had written the book, it came out and everything, I was talking to this dude about it. He's like, that's not even true. Like cannabis totally was already in North America way before the conquistadors came in the 1400s. It came from Asia across the land bridge. I'm like, oh, fuck, you're right. You're so right. And so I always wish I could go back and like redraw that part of the book. Be like, no, that didn't, that's just something that was in some book and everybody repeated it, and I did it too.
Yes.
That's so
I
hard.
just love the question also, and I myself, been a cartoonist for about 40 years, and the hardest thing I think that I've come up to is I've always been my early work was very like reactive to every issue, and in recent years I find that I'm trying to step myself back and think about how do I take the conversation to some people who might want to listen to it, who don't have, or it's not so intense. And it was one of the hardest things to like stop towards the end of a cartoon and say, I can either end this in my usual way or try to do something that's more open-ended or more complex instead of the answer is this.
Right.
And that's a challenge I'm currently facing all the time, is how to make it more, and I think whether that's a function of my age or the times, I don't know, but I think not to just go my usual route, but to do something different.
Well, there's more room now, right, to explain stuff. Whereas, like, because we work in longer form now, we work in these book format and stuff like that. Whereas a lot of earlier work, especially with political cartoons and stuff, you didn't have the space. It was newspapers. It was
like one panel.
Yeah. So a lot of it is that, like, and you're mad when you're writing this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like, you want, I'm not sitting here fuming at my desk, but I'm like, wanting to hammer home this point that I'm making, because like, I know people will read it and listen to this. I could speak till I'm blue in the face, no one gives a shit, but they'll read this
Yeah.
comic strip. But it is important, and it's right. And a lot of times when I'm making the strip, especially, I'm like writing something, and I'm like, there is actually a more nuanced part of this particular sentence. But like, you can only fit so much in the panel.
Yeah.
So you're like, you gotta take sometimes those parenthetical things out, and it just keep it streamlined to the point that you're trying to make. But every time I do that, there's always somebody that's like, well, actually, panel 3, didn't you think about it? And I was like, yes, I did think about that, but that's an extremely rare case. There's only so much room in these panels to make like asterisks and be like,
People
actually,
do not understand that text occupies space.
Yeah.
Especially writers. When someone writes a comic for you to illustrate, it's like they don't know that.
I collaborated with this guy that wrote this book about Russia. Whenever he's like, this will be about 2 pages, I'm like, no, that's like a 10-page
Absolutely
thing.
not.
But I had him just write. I just adapted his prose. I didn't have him even try to write it. This is the
I
comics
think that's
prose.
wise.
Yeah. It ended up being longer than because I had to just kind of like estimate how long I thought it might end up being, and it was a little bit longer than I had anticipated.
Yes.
Sorry, I have another.
Please.
So I'm just curious, in nonfiction and the kind of work that you all do, like, and Brian, you kind of talked about this a little bit with the bunny character, but that's a narrator, but what are your thoughts about the balance of introducing like dialogue to address these issues versus like controlling it more or less with a narrative voice and providing that kind of structure?
So like, when you do when you add narrative, like a narrative piece to something, it's like, when I do it anyway, it's always like a very long story to make a point that could have been made in a sentence, but you need that in there, you know what I mean? So when you're doing like information dense books, you can't like have it, you have to have parts in it, I think, that are a little bit explaining stuff. And if it's all narrative,
It's an illustrated textbook.
yeah, you're like, it's good though. I mean, people, if you're telling like a nonfiction story, that's just like a one story, that's cool. But you're working on larger themes, that like you may understand at the end of the book. Whereas like a lot of times, in this case, you're trying to just get across a certain amount of information quickly. So I think like it's good to have both though. I mean, because those narrative pieces break things up, break up all that information heavy thing, and they also like help take this information that you just explained and put it into application in a situation that you've created. But you get less. It's weird, like it's longer, but you get less information in there.
Yeah.
Less specific information. It's more like emotional stuff and the feeling of how these things are applied to real life.
That's leads me to a question I had with these types of comics, with social activism in comics. You want the reader to take something away and actually have an action step. It's like they will change something about their lives. Maybe they have a conversation with their partner about consent issues, or STIs, or they want to get active suddenly in a local movement around, affordable housing or cannabis laws. And I'm curious if you folks have some examples of your work actually like spurring that social change and someone telling you about it, like how your work actually led them down a path that they wouldn't have gone down before. Yes.
Yeah, I had a really lovely one. So my sex ed book that I didn't bring today is distributed at a number of colleges, but I specifically made it for the college that I went to, and they funded the first printing. And so it's at this point, many students have read it. And at one point, I think I was in a bar or something, and I met someone. He was like, "Oh, I went to SAIC. You went to SAIC?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "I actually made those books that the freshmen get." And he was like, "That book?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "That book got me to get tested." And I was like, "Cool." And he was like, "And I had chlamydia." And I was like, "Cool." And he was like, "Yeah." And then I told my girlfriend, and she had chlamydia, and we both got it treated. And I was like, "That's the point of the book. That's great."
He would have been suffering.
He would have been
And
suffering.
his girlfriend.
They both would have been suffering. Yeah. So.
I have people
Hooray.
tell
Buy you
me.
a drink?
What'd you
Did
say?
he buy you a drink?
He didn't.
I have people write me a lot that tell me that they stopped going to cannabis dispensaries because of my work, because in some states there's just no legal option that is a good choice for sustainability or anything or helping the market. And a lot of times people write me and they're like, "What do I do? What do I do if there's nobody in my area that's beneficial to buy from?" And I'm like, "Just buy it." I'm like, "You're a patient. You need your medicine." It sucks, but it's something that you can know and maybe in the future make it better for yourself. But in this situation, it would be like you couldn't tell somebody not to take their medicine because it's being made by a shitty pharmaceutical company, like all of our medicines. But you got to take your medicine. You don't have to go that far into activism that you're hurting yourself or not getting the relief that you need. But people do write to me all the time about that, and I'm like, "Yes, you got it." Because I never specifically, I'm like, "Don't buy from these guys." It's more like, this is what these people are doing, and they kind of come to the conclusion on their own.
So one of the comics that I did, the accessibility comic from McMaster, ended up being used a couple of years later as kind of part of a call to action for this broader zine project. And that felt just so energizing to then be part of that zine. And it was, students from the United States and from Canada who were all contributing to kind of this broadening of the conversation of what does accessibility look like in education, what are teaching practices you wish you had seen when you were a student, what was your experience as a student, like trying to get accommodations, what did that look like? So I loved the bridging of mediums and jumping into more of a written form and getting to see a lot of artwork emerge from that as well.
We have about 10 minutes left. Any other questions or comments from the audience at this time? Yes, the camera person in the back.
Coming at it from the angle that you do through art, do you guys deal with activist burnout just as much as people who organize deal with it? And how do you deal with it if you do?
Yeah, I get annoyed with the activists once a week, where I'm like, why am I doing this? Because everybody's mad at everybody about everything. like, so this big, so there was like, you guys might have heard about the Biden announcement on cannabis like last week. So there was like a lot, you know, it's in some ways a mixed bag. Like it's not everything everyone has been pushing for a long time. Like, you know, he is pardoning federal low-level possession offenses, which is like very few people get federally charged with. My friend actually has one of these charges, and it's because he was at a protest at the Liberty Bell, and they charged him with a federal possession charge. But it's extremely rare. So it's a little bit, you know, people are a little bit mad. They're like, this isn't releasing people from prison, this isn't. But, you know, it's like, then you have to be like, well, listen, Biden actually can't release state prisoners. He can only advise them to do it, which he did do that. And they're like, but they're not going to do it. And like, I hear you, man. They're not going to do it, some of them. But like, he couldn't do that much. But the big thing is the descheduling or rescheduling thing that they might do, which is actually big. And like, that was something that had to happen. He like had to do it in this weird way where he writes a letter to the Director of Health and Human Services, and they consider changing it. It's like this whole arcane process. But it has to happen that way. And they're like, there's so many people that were like, he should just write an executive order legalizing weed across. It's like, Biden is not going to do that. Like, he just did an enormous thing. And listen, I have a lot of complaints about it too, and about this specifically, but like, you got to if you don't give them any credit ever for doing anything, like, then you're just acting kind of in bad faith, I feel like. And so, like, this week was so annoying. Like, all these activists are like, well, fuck it. And so many people see a picture of the president, and it's just like, immediately, like, becomes like this Trump-Biden fight thing. And I'm like, I'm just reporting on what the president said, and it's going to affect you personally. And it's crazy.
It seems very fashionable in activism to be angry, and that even when small steps are made forward, to be angry that the steps weren't bigger.
Yeah.
And I personally prefer to be like, yeah, small step.
I mean,
What's
I always
next?
think that we should push for the largest possible steps.
Right.
But, and in that way, we'll get further. Like, we're pushing for the furthest thing.
Yeah.
And then they give us a little bit of this. You're getting further than if you pushed for this, and then they give you something a little bit. So, but you got to acknowledge when something does happen.
Yeah.
You can't be like, nothing happened. Something happened.
And like, speaking to burnout, one of the ways to like keep burnout a little farther away is to celebrate small successes. Like, celebrate each little tiny piece instead of like waiting for the end that probably won't happen ever.
There's just so much
until you're
negativity
dead.
all the time, you know? There's so much people are mad all the time, and there's so much media that comes out that's like literally there just to make people mad.
Yeah.
Like the way it's framed, it's like there to get people riled up. And so people are just like mad as hell online.
Yeah.
And so that's something you have to deal with.
And it's like encouraged and glorified, and it's like, if you're not angry, you're bad.
You know, it's interesting. One thing I learned from my time working in national politics, you know, working with progressive groups and grassroots movements, was just how many grifters there are.
Yeah.
Like people who make money off of the outrage, whether they have some, you know, account or subscription service. They don't actually do anything, but they just make money off the outrage, and they will shift. And this is a bigger problem on the right. You know, the right is mostly just grifters and con men at this time. But on the left, we do have a number of people who are insincere about their support, and to the point of, you know, kind of accepting small steps. You know, we often, when I was working in politics, said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of good. You know, I spent 10 years working on healthcare policy. I think we should have a single-payer healthcare system, Medicare for all. But the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, was a step forward. It brought healthcare to millions of Americans, you know, and insurance companies couldn't ignore a person's pre-existing conditions. You know, not a perfect law by any means, you know, and more work to be done, but let's not, you know.
So the thing that like gets people, it's confusing when you're talking about the grifters, which is like, it's on the left. I mean, it's in cannabis legalization. So it's like people that are ostensibly, this is like a common scam. So there's a group that is ostensibly there to promote social equity applicants and help people, you know, black and brown people who have been arrested, help them get into the business. But this is often like the other side of a scam created by corporations who actually just want the social equity license, and they need a social equity applicant to be the pigeon, basically. And the person that's out there trying to help people, all they're doing is introducing prey, the grifters first. They're finding the guy for the grifter to grift. You know what I mean? So it's like, then it's like when you call those people out, then it's like, well, they're these guys are the ones doing good. And it's like, no, they're not. They're pretending to do good. They're actually doing bad. So there's that.
Yes, yeah.
It's very confusing.
We have 5 minutes left. I want to see from our panelists any kind of last words or any advice to cartoonists who are interested in having social activism be part of their work.
I would just say that there's a lot of people screaming and talking, and very few people actually making comics about stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so comics just cut through
Yeah.
the conversation in that way. And it's like we were talking about at the beginning, there's like a power to it. It's like, it's not just lines on paper. I mean, it is just lines on paper, but it's more than that.
I was trying to hype myself to finish one more comic before I came to this, and so I'll hold myself accountable to do this next week. But I think the comic that I wanted to do was going to be an example of like the ways that you can take creative action in this time. I mean, it's such a bizarre political environment. We're all focusing on different issues, but it's all really interrelated in a lot of ways, and so. I want to point folks to look at this particular resource called Beautiful Trouble, which is this just beautiful repository of international action strategies, and some of those can play into visual artwork and the ways that can be used like in person in real time. But I have a small affinity group and some friends. We went to counter-protest the protesters, the pro-life protesters at a Planned Parenthood very recently, and we did some beautiful kind of comic-based chalking on the sidewalk and had a wonderful dance party. And so I'm gonna make a comic memorializing that, because it's like, this is super easy. Took 3 people and some chalk, and we made our point, and had a lot of people supporting us and joining from the sidewalk in this neighborhood. And so I think lifting up that sort of work is important.
I think it is really powerful, like Brian said, and I think you should definitely do it if you want to do it. Just like understand that there's power to it, and that means there's responsibility to it as well. Make sure that you're citing your sources, that you're finding your information from creditable sources, and don't be afraid to like ask other people for help if you're like, oh, I'm staying in my lane, I'm making work about an issue that affects me personally, but I want it to be intersectional, so it's like including stuff about demographics that I'm not in. Like, find sensitivity readers, like ask other people to look at it. I think that's going to make your comic a lot better.
And before we wrap up, I just want to take a gauge from the audience here. Who here is a Vermont resident or Vermont voter? Raise your hand. Okay.
Wow.
2 quick action steps. This is going to be a very important election this November, especially here in Vermont. Obviously, all the state, local, and federal races matter. We have 2 constitutional amendments on the ballot here in Vermont. The first to remove the last of the slavery language from the Vermont Constitution, and the second to make reproductive liberty a constitutional right here in Vermont. So please, if you are not registered to vote, go get registered. Make sure you show up to the polls in November or get an early ballot and participate. Constitutional amendments need 2/3 majority to pass, and quite frankly, these are going to be squeakers. These are going to be close. We need everyone to get out there and vote and support these 2 constitutional amendments. Also want to say, after today's session, please go check out these cartoonists' work. Being a cartoonist is very hard, and there's not a lot of money in it. If you can afford to support their work financially, please do so. They all have lots of work for sale downstairs. So go swing by their table later and support them financially if you can. And let's give them all a round of applause for what they're doing.